I can still hear the crackle of tension in the air, the hush that fell over the wedding crowd moments after my mother hurled a wad of crumpled bills onto my sister's pristine white gown. In an instant, the fairy tale ceremony, soft violins, candlelit arches, the smell of fresh roses, twisted into a living nightmare. Shocked gasps rippled among the guests, their eyes darting between my mother's furious face and my sister's trembling hands. Yet it wasn't the scattered money that tore at my heart, it was what my mother said next. Those words, dripping with bitterness, made me realize that the real damage ran far deeper than any public humiliation could show. A family on shaky ground. Long before the wedding fiasco, the cracks in our family dynamic were evident. My mother, Diane, had always been fiercely protective, some might say overbearing. As a single parent, she raised my older sister Jennifer and me with unrelenting discipline, determined we wouldn't suffer the same struggles she'd faced. Our father left when I was 3, leaving her bitter, resentful of men, and certain that if we didn't achieve perfect lives, we'd crumble under the same humiliations she endured. Growing up, Jennifer and I learned to tiptoe around her unpredictable moods. She demanded straight A's in school, a disciplined approach to extracurriculars, and unwavering respect. Jennifer, older by 2 years, seemed to handle that pressure better. She thrived academically, perfected her violin skills, and became the star child who seldom disappointed. Meanwhile, I stumbled, my grades lagged, and I rebelled with small acts like joining the art club instead of debate, or sneaking out with friends. I was never reckless, but in my mother's eyes, anything short of her standard was a direct challenge. Despite her controlling nature, there were moments of warmth. Family dinners where we laughed about silly things, or nights when she read stories to us by the fireplace, her voice softened by love. But overshadowing all of that was her unwavering belief that money was the key to escaping misery, and that we, her daughters, needed to prove ourselves worthy. When Jennifer announced her engagement to Brian, a kind, soft-spoken man she met at a volunteer event, our mother's reaction was surprisingly muted. I half expected her to rage that Jennifer should focus on her career first. Instead, she offered polite smiles and cryptic remarks about hoping Brian can provide for you. Over the next year, she remained superficially supportive, occasionally offering to help pay for wedding expenses. But Jennifer politely declined. Brian and I want a simple wedding. We don't want your money, she insisted. Looking back, I suspect that stance festered in my mother's pride, planting seeds that would sprout on the wedding day. Pre-wedding tensions. As the wedding date approached, I noticed small frictions intensifying. During a family brunch, my mother grilled Brian about his finances, ignoring the tension in Jennifer's eyes. Your job at the nonprofit, does it pay enough to keep a household afloat? She prodded. Brian, unaccustomed to such direct questioning, tried to politely answer, but the conversation left everyone uneasy. Jennifer cornered me in the kitchen afterward, tears brimming. I can't take this, she whispered. Mom's picking him apart. She keeps offering money for the wedding, but we want to do it ourselves. She's acting like it's an insult that we won't let her foot the bill. I offered what comfort I could, reminding Jennifer that once she was married, she'd be free to set boundaries. Mom will adjust eventually, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. Our mother's track record suggested otherwise. Still, the wedding planning churned on. Jennifer booked a modest but elegant venue, a renovated barn with wooden beams, fairy lights, and a wide field blossoming with wildflowers. It was the perfect reflection of her and Brian, unpretentious, welcoming, full of subtle beauty. She lined up a small quartet to play classical music, arranged for simple but delicious catering, and invited close family and friends. I, as maid of honor, helped finalize the seating chart and wrangle the florist. We all expected a day of gentle, loving celebration. But beneath the surface, my mother simmered. She hated that she wasn't invited to bankroll the wedding. She dropped passive-aggressive comments about how it must not be easy for them to pay for everything alone, or maybe they'll regret turning down my contribution. Jennifer tried to remain gracious, but I could tell she dreaded a blow-up. The wedding day arrives. The morning of Jennifer's wedding dawned bright and promising. Sunlight streamed over the barn's rustic exterior, dew glistening on the wildflowers. I arrived early, stepping inside to see the decorators adding final touches, arranging small bouquets on each table, setting the dais for the quartet, adjusting the drapery above the altar. The wooden rafters glowed in the morning light, and a sense of calm enveloped me. This was going to be a good day, I told myself. I found Jennifer in the small bridal suite, carefully applying light makeup. She wore a simple ivory gown with lace trimming, her hair in a loose bun accented by daisies. She looked radiant. Our eyes met in the mirror, and I smiled, tears threatening. "You look beautiful," I whispered. She breathed a sigh of relief. "I'm so happy you're here. Let's hope Mom keeps it together." I nodded, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Our mother had insisted on arriving at the last minute to avoid getting in the way, though I suspected she wanted to make a dramatic entrance. Sure enough, half an hour before the ceremony, the barn door swung open, and she strode in wearing a sleek navy dress, hair styled in an immaculate chignon. She carried herself like royalty, scanning the venue with a faint air of disapproval. But to my surprise, she said nothing overtly negative, only offered Jennifer a tight-lipped smile and took her seat. The ceremony itself was lovely. Jennifer walked down the aisle on the arm of our mother's old friend, a stand-in for our absent father. Brian looked awestruck at the altar, tears glimmering in his eyes. The officiant spoke eloquent words about love, partnership, and the journey forward. When they exchanged vows, the hush in the barn felt electric, a collective recognition of the sincerity between them. I blinked back tears as Jennifer slid the ring onto Brian's trembling hand, a surge of pride welling in me. She was forging her own path, stepping beyond our mother's controlling shadow, and choosing love on her own terms. After the kiss, applause thundered in the cozy space. The newlyweds walked out, beaming, hand in hand. Outside, photos commenced in the wildflower field. The guests began drifting toward the barn's reception area, sipping cider or champagne from rustic mason jars. Everything felt perfect. My mother hovered in a corner, expression guarded, but I told myself she'd keep any negativity at bay. The reception took place inside the barn, where tables were set with crisp white linens and jars of wildflowers. The overhead string lights twinkled as twilight approached. I found myself near the dessert table, chatting with relatives who expressed how impressed they were by Jennifer's thoughtful personal touches. Brian's parents circulated happily, praising their new daughter-in-law. Then came the toasts. I braced myself as we gathered around the head table. I went first, offering a short, heartfelt speech about how Jennifer's unwavering kindness changed my life. I got choked up talking about our childhood, how she shielded me from bullies and taught me about generosity. Brian wiped tears from his eyes, hugging Jennifer's shoulder. The crowd cheered, raising glasses. Next, the best man gave a funny, warm tribute to Brian. Then, it was my mother's turn. She rose, smoothing her navy dress, taking the mic with a poise that turned every head. I silently prayed she'd keep things positive. She began calmly, "I'm so proud of Jennifer for becoming the woman she is. Brian, you're a lucky man." A mild applause followed. My mother cast a sweeping glance around the barn. "I regret that I didn't have a bigger role in this wedding. But that was my daughter's choice," she added, her tone frosty. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. I cringed inside. Still, she continued with measured grace, praising their love and the barn's rustic charm. "Just when I hoped the tension might blow over," she added, "I guess they decided they didn't need my financial help," in a tight smile. But I still came prepared. From her designer clutch, she pulled out a checkbook and pen, scribbling dramatically. Then, to my horror, she tore the check free and flung it onto the table in front of Jennifer. The flutter of paper landing on the pristine linen felt surreal, like a slap in the face. Gasps erupted among the guests, confused and startled. My sister's face strained. "Mom, what are you doing?" she whispered. Brian tensed beside her. My mother's voice rang through the sudden hush. "There," she said curtly, "in case you change your mind. If you ever realize that this wedding, this marriage," she waved a dismissive hand, "needs more than you think, you'll have it." She let out a cold laugh. "Because clearly, you can't survive without me, no matter what you think." The silence shatters. A heartbeat of stunned silence, broken only by the squeak of a guest shifting in their chair. My sister's eyes shimmered with tears, her lips parted in shock. I felt anger surge, but the worst was yet to come. Brian, brow furrowed, touched Jennifer's arm. She looked poised to retort, but before she could, our mother turned her gaze on me. "And you," she said, voice dripping with disdain. My spine stiffened. "You're so quick to defend your sister, to talk about independence. Yet, you come to me for help every time you can't make rent, or your car breaks down." She let out a hollow chuckle. "But here I am, throwing money at your sister's wedding, money she claims not to need. Money neither of you appreciate." Her next words, however, landed a deeper blow. I should have known you'd side with her, because neither of you has ever been truly grateful for what I've done. I wasted my youth working for you too. And look how you repay me, shutting me out, ignoring my advice, belittling my efforts. No wonder your father left. This family is impossible. A stricken hush blanketed the barn. My mother's face was twisted, tears welling in her eyes. She was lashing out from a place of deep hurt, but her cruelty stung like hot coals. Jennifer stared at me, shock mingling with heartbreak. Brian's parents exchanged horrified glances. I felt my eyes burn with tears. The worst part was hearing her drag up our father's desertion, a raw wound she knew would cut deep. It was one thing to humiliate Jennifer by throwing money, but to hurl those words about me, about how we had driven our father away, felt like a knife through my chest. A breaking point. The hush was so profound I could hear my heart thudding in my ears. Half the guests gazed at the floor, unsure whether to intervene or slip out. The string lights overhead seemed to flicker ominously, or maybe it was my blurred vision from tears. My sister tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat, tears trickling down her cheeks. She'd wanted so badly to have a drama-free wedding, and now our mother was overshadowing everything with bitterness. Finally, Brian stood. His usually gentle expression hardened with resolve. "Mrs. Clark," he addressed my mother quietly but firmly, "we respect your sacrifices. We always have. But this is our wedding, and we asked you not to pay for it because we wanted to do it on our own. That doesn't mean we're ungrateful." My mother gave a derisive snort, but Brian pressed on. "I can't let you speak to Jennifer and her sister like this. They're strong women who have navigated enough heartbreak without you throwing blame and money around. If you can't speak with kindness on our day, I'll have to ask you to leave." A ripple of shock spread among the crowd. Even I was taken aback by Brian's boldness. He usually avoided confrontation, but I saw in his eyes a fierce protectiveness for Jennifer and me. My mother's face hardened, lip curling in anger, but she didn't move. She seemed trapped by her own pride, uncertain how to respond. The check she'd tossed lay conspicuously on the tablecloth, a silent testament to the ugly turn events had taken. Jennifer found her voice, ragged with tears. "Mom," she said, voice trembling, "I love you. I wanted you here as my mother, not my wallet. This wedding was never about shutting you out. It was about me and Brian building something for ourselves. But now you're humiliating us, throwing money and hateful words, and it's breaking my heart." For a moment, my mother's eyes flickered with guilt. She opened her mouth, but no words emerged. The raw emotion in Jennifer's voice seemed to deflate her. Then, in a sudden rush, she yanked her purse from the table, snatched the check back, and declared, "Fine. If my presence ruins everything, I'll go. Enjoy your perfect wedding." Her voice cracked, but her fury propelled her toward the barn doors. I watched her retreating figure, stunned, tears slipping down my cheeks. The wedding guests parted in silence as she stormed out, leaving behind a swirl of confusion and heartbreak. Brian's mother placed a hand over her mouth in horror, not sure how to console. My father-in-law figure, non-existent, as we hadn't seen him in years, wasn't there to quell the flames. Once my mother disappeared outside, the hush lingered. Finally, a few well-meaning guests tried to rally the party, offering nervous laughter or suggestions of returning to the buffet. Jennifer, trembling, turned to me, tears streaming. "I'm so sorry," she choked. "She never should have said those things about you, about Dad. None of it was fair." She collapsed into my arms, sobbing. I held her tight, ignoring my own tears, wanting only to comfort her on what should have been her happiest day. Brian rubbed her back, whispering that everything would be okay. I glanced around the barn. People were quietly dispersing or trying to salvage the mood. The quartet resumed playing a soft, tentative tune, as if unsure whether music could possibly bandage the lacerations inflicted by my mother's anger. Strained revelations. The rest of the reception limped on in a subdued manner. The atmosphere never fully recovered. Jennifer and Brian cut the cake, offered polite smiles to their guests, and tried to keep dancing. But the specter of my mother's outburst hovered. I stayed close to Jennifer, occasionally fielding awkward questions from friends who asked, "Is your mother all right? Or shouldn't someone check on her?" Each time, I forced a polite response, explaining she needed space. Inside, I was reeling from what she'd said. "No wonder your father left. This family is impossible." The words cut deep because I knew she'd always blamed him for leaving, claimed he was the selfish one. Now, in a moment of rage, she revealed her own belief that maybe we, her daughters, were at fault, that we were so broken he couldn't bear to stay. The thought churned my stomach. I wanted to confront her, demand an explanation. But she'd fled, leaving me alone with that poisonous thought. As the night wore on, Jennifer forced a watery smile for the final dance. Then we said our goodbyes to guests. The moment the last car pulled away, I found her slumped on a hay bale in a small side room, face in her hands. "Why?" she whispered hoarsely. "Why can't Mom ever just let me be happy?" I sat beside her, arms around her shoulders. "She's hurting," I murmured. "It's no excuse, but she's carried bitterness for years. She wants to control things, to prove she can keep us from failing like she once did. Maybe it's fear, maybe it's pride, maybe both." She leaned into me, tears soaking my shoulder. "I'm worried this destroyed any chance of us reconciling." I had no answer, only a heavy weight in my chest. She was the bride, yet overshadowed by a mother's meltdown. I stroked her hair, murmuring that we'd figure something out, that it wasn't her fault. Inside, I felt the sting of my mother's final words about me, that unspoken sense that I was to blame, that we both were. The aftermath. In the following days, Jennifer and Brian went on a short honeymoon, though the cloud of the wedding fiasco lingered. She texted me sporadically, admitting it was hard to relax fully, but Brian did his best to comfort her. Meanwhile, I stayed home, nursing my own emotional wounds. My mother refused my calls, ignoring me entirely. She wouldn't answer the door when I dropped by her house. It felt as though her fury had hardened into a wall of silence, cutting me out. I sought advice from my Aunt Grace, a distant but warm presence in our family. She sighed heavily upon hearing the story. "Your mother's always had a temper, but this. I suspect she's unleashing old wounds from her marriage. Maybe she feels overshadowed by your father's absence, or by you two forging lives without her. Give her time, but be prepared that she might never apologize." My heart clenched. I didn't want to think we'd be estranged forever. Despite her flaws, I loved my mother. We'd shared good moments. But the venom in her voice at the wedding replayed in my mind like a loop, each iteration leaving me more unsettled. Eventually, Jennifer returned from her honeymoon, still shaken but determined to move forward. "We're having a small get-together at our apartment this weekend," she told me. "Friends, leftover wedding cake. You should come. Maybe invite Mom too." I sighed. She's not answering me, but I can drop by her place with an invite. I did exactly that, tucking a handwritten note into her mailbox. "Mom, Jennifer wants you to come to a small post-wedding gathering. We'd love to see you. Please let me know." No response. The day of the gathering came and went, with no sign of her. Jennifer tried to hide her hurt, focusing on the well-wishers who did show up. A reluctant reunion. Weeks later, an opportunity for a reunion arose. Our mother's birthday loomed, and Jennifer insisted on hosting a small family dinner at her new place. She told me, "I sent an invitation to Mom. If she doesn't come, we'll know she's still shutting us out." I braced for another disappointment, but to our surprise, on the night of the dinner, the doorbell rang and there stood my mother. She wore a stiff expression, carrying a small gift bag. Brian greeted her politely, stepping aside so she could enter. Jennifer and I exchanged glances of mingled relief and anxiety. My mother offered a subdued hello, refusing to meet our eyes. We guided her to the living room, where a modest spread of food awaited. Tension swirled, making every breath heavy. The conversation was stilted at first. Jennifer tried small talk about her new job. Brian asked if my mother was well. She responded tersely. Finally, Jennifer took a shaky breath and said, "Mom, can we talk about the wedding? I don't want that to be the last memory we share." Our mother's eyes flashed with a hint of pain. She set her teacup down, pursing her lips. "I said some things I regret," she murmured, voice taut. "But I won't apologize for wanting to protect you from a life of hardship." Jennifer's frustration edged into her tone. "Brian and I are fine, Mom. We wanted a wedding that reflected us, not your wallet. That doesn't mean we'd starve without you." They locked gazes, a silent battle. My mother exhaled. "I see that. And I was out of line. Especially throwing money in your face." She paused, eyes flicking to me. But I was also upset, feeling like no one needed me. I felt worthless. Like you two were proving you could do better than I ever did. That's what made me lash out. My heart squeezed. That was the closest thing to an apology we'd heard from her in ages. Gently, I said, "Mom, we do need you, but not in the way you think. We need your love, your support, not your money or blame." Her gaze flickered. "You say that," she whispered, "but how many times have you come to me in a panic about your finances?" She bit her lip, struggling with bitterness. "Sometimes I feel all I'm good for is bailing you out." Tears rimmed her eyes. "When your father left, I vowed never to let us sink. I worked my body to the bone. And maybe I turned controlling, but it was the only way I knew to keep from losing everything." My mother's voice cracked. "When you both started living your own lives, shutting me out of major decisions, it stung. At the wedding, seeing I was basically sidelined, I lost control. Confronting the pain." A heavy silence enveloped the room. Brian discreetly withdrew to the kitchen, giving us space. Jennifer and I exchanged glances, each mustering courage. Finally, Jennifer spoke, tears in her eyes. "Mom, I never meant to sideline you. I love you, but you can be so overbearing. When it came to the wedding, I wanted to prove that Brian and I could stand on our own. I wanted to show you that we'd be okay. But that didn't mean we didn't want you there as our mother." My mother's tears slipped free, her facade crumbling. "Then why not let me help with money? Why shut me out of everything, from venue choice to decorations?" Jennifer rubbed her face. "Because I was afraid you'd take over. You'd overshadow my preferences, micromanage every detail. I wanted it to be about me and Brian, not about your fear or demands." With a trembling sigh, my mother said, "I see. And I guess I turned that fear into resentment. I blamed you for not needing me, and I blamed your sister for, well, a lot of things. I said something awful. No wonder your father left. This family is impossible. I didn't mean that. He left because he had his own demons. But that day, I was so consumed by anger that I wanted to lash out." She turned to me, her gaze softened by regret. "I'm sorry, truly, for making it sound like you or Jennifer drove him away. That was cruel and baseless. I know you've carried guilt over his absence for years." My throat tightened, tears surfacing. I nodded wordlessly, relief and sorrow mingling at her partial acknowledgement of the damage inflicted. Cautiously, Jennifer scooted closer, placing a hand on our mother's. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot. But you've got to understand, we can't keep living in a cycle where you lash out every time you feel threatened. We want you in our lives, but not at the cost of constant emotional strain." My mother squeezed her eyes shut. "I understand. I don't want to be that person either. I just don't know how else to be sometimes." A path toward healing. That night, we talked for hours. My mother opened up about her deep-seated insecurities, how losing her husband made her fixate on controlling finances so we'd never be left vulnerable. Jennifer and I shared how her suffocating approach only pushed us away, creating the opposite effect of what she intended. We didn't solve every issue, nor did we fix decades of complicated family dynamics in one conversation. But we laid the foundation for a new kind of honesty. When the evening ended, we embraced in a tangle of tears and whispered reassurances. My mother promised to respect our boundaries, to let us make our choices without condemnation. Jennifer promised to keep her in the loop on major life changes, letting her feel included without ceding control. I, still reeling from the words about our father, promised to see a therapist about my lingering guilt. We parted with a fragile sense of hope, though we knew the road ahead would be bumpy. The realization that freed me. In the subsequent weeks, something shifted within me. My mother's outburst at the wedding and her subsequent apology forced me to confront a truth I'd avoided. I'd secretly harbored guilt that maybe our father's departure was partly my fault. My mother's rageful comment had unleashed that fear into the open. But hearing her admit it was baseless gave me permission to release the blame I'd carried. I realized my father's departure was never about me or Jennifer. It was about his own demons, his inability to cope with family responsibility. That clarity lifted a weight off my shoulders. I felt more compassionate toward my mother, understanding that her anger was fueled by her own trauma. Meanwhile, Jennifer settled into married life, forging a gentle, supportive partnership with Brian. They invited my mother to occasional dinners, testing the waters. She visited, kept her criticisms in check, even brought small gifts that actually felt thoughtful rather than imposing. Our extended family learned bits and pieces of the wedding debacle, but we kept the details private. Over time, The sensational gossip died down, replaced by daily life and new community events. Some relatives rolled their eyes at my mother's drama, but we explained that we were working through it as a family. The orchard wedding, once overshadowed by tension, became a memory tinged with sorrow yet also a turning point for all of us. 1 year after the wedding, Jennifer and Brian planned a small anniversary gathering at the same renovated barn. This time it was just close family and a few friends, no formal ceremony or extravagant meal, just potluck dishes, a string of lights, and a reflection of how far we'd come. Jennifer nervously invited our mother, unsure if she'd have a meltdown. But to our relief, my mother accepted, even offering to bring a homemade casserole. When we arrived, the barn looked almost the same, rustic beams, dancing shadows in the late afternoon sun, wildflowers swaying outside. The difference was in the air, a sense of calm, a readiness to enjoy each other's company. My mother joined in setting the table, greeting Brian's parents politely. She still occasionally made pointed remarks about finances, but we gently teased her, turning tension into laughter. She recognized the shift and attempted to check herself. During a brief toast, Brian raised his glass of iced tea. "A year ago we had a wedding that was chaotic," he said, glancing around with a rueful grin. A soft chuckle spread. "But the aftermath forced us to confront important truths. I'm grateful we've all come through stronger, more honest with each other. I'm proud to call Jennifer my wife and you all my family." We clinked cups, a humble but sincere celebration. Jennifer looped an arm around me, her face beaming. Our mother looked on, lips curving in a small, genuine smile. There was no dramatic apology or emotional meltdown this time, just the quiet acceptance that we were healing, day by day. And in that moment, I realized something vital. The memory of my mother throwing money at my sister's wedding, followed by those venomous words, would never be erased. But it no longer defined us. We had confronted the pain, peeled back the layers of mistrust and pride, and allowed love to show its face. Love that didn't revolve around controlling finances or hurling blame, but around acceptance of each other's flaws and past mistakes. Epilogue, a new chapter for us all. Life, of course, continued beyond that anniversary gathering. Jennifer moved up in her job, Brian found a new passion in teaching, and I found a sense of freedom from guilt and self-doubt. My mother gradually softened, though old habits die hard. She still occasionally offered unsolicited advice or borderline insulting remarks about our finances. But we learned to talk back, to set gentle boundaries, to remind her she was loved without letting her run our lives. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I recall the night of the wedding reception, the hush of the barn, the flicker of those overhead lights, the dull thud of money hitting white linens, and my mother's anger reverberating in her next words. I remember the tightness in my chest, the tears, the heartbreak. But I also remember Brian standing up for Jennifer, my sister's trembling courage, and eventually the vulnerability that led my mother to apologize, at least in her own guarded way. Our family isn't perfect, nor will it ever be. The scars remain, faint reminders of the battles fought. But scars can tell stories of healing as well as hurt. My mother's meltdown forced us all to reckon with uncomfortable truths, to face the trauma and bitterness that had accumulated through the years. Now, each time I see Jennifer holding Brian's hand, hear them talk about future hopes, maybe children, a new home, I feel a swell of pride. They built this life on their own terms, forging a marriage that withstood the worst day imaginable. My mother, for her part, has started volunteering at a local community center, channeling her need to help financially into something constructive rather than controlling. And I, no longer shackled by the fear of paternal abandonment or maternal condemnation, have embraced a renewed sense of purpose, writing about family dynamics, sharing my experiences, and finding that empathy can transcend even the harshest words thrown in anger. Occasionally, I catch glimpses of my mother's old self, sharp criticisms or anxious remarks about money, but I respond now with patience. If she flings a barbed comment, I gently remind her we won't revert to the past. She usually quiets, offering a nod that suggests she's trying. For all her flaws, she remains our mother, shaped by her own painful history. I wish I could say we all lived happily ever after. Reality is more nuanced. Some days we slip back into old tensions. Some nights I awake from dreams of that wedding meltdown, sweat on my brow. But the difference is we talk about it, own our mistakes, and hold on to the newfound closeness that rose from the ashes. In the end, the memory of my mother throwing money at my sister during her wedding will forever be etched in my mind. Yet the moment that cut me deepest was her bitter claim that we were the reason our father left, that somehow we were unworthy. Over time, I learned to see that accusation as a reflection of her own pain rather than a truth about us. And in releasing that weight, I discovered the power of forgiveness, not the naive kind that forgets wrongdoing, but the strong, deliberate choice to move forward in love despite the hurt. That's the story of how my mother's meltdown at my sister's wedding altered the trajectory of our family. A day meant for celebration erupted into heartbreak, yet from that heartbreak sprouted the seeds of understanding, introspection, and a more resilient bond. We remain a messy, complicated family, but we're also a family that no longer flees from confrontation or hides behind illusions of perfection. In the barn where it happened, life goes on. New couples book it for their special day, weaving their own stories under the rustic beams and fairy lights. Sometimes I wonder if a faint echo of our family drama lingers in the rafters, a cautionary whisper for other families grappling with hidden tensions. Or maybe the barn is just a barn, and the real transformations took place within our hearts. Either way, we moved on, carrying both the scars and the deeper compassion that only emerges when illusions are shattered and truth steps into the light.